Welcome again to our discussion on neocolonialism and independence in Africa and other third world countries. With my group members, we'll be looking at the countries and other regions of the world where this topic is relevant. First of all, let's look at neocolonialism, which refers to the continued economic and political and cultural dominance of former colonial powers over previously colonized nations, particularly in Africa and other third world countries. Unlike classical colonialism, which involved direct control and territorial occupation, neocolonialism operates through indirect means, and example is such as economic influence, political pressure, and cultural dominance. Many African countries or African and third world nations, despite gaining formal independence, remain dependent on former colonial powers and international institutions, which depend on foreign aid and multinational corporations and unfair trade relations. Neocolonialism perpetuates underdevelopment or encourages underdevelopment, weakens national sovereignty, and limits the ability of these countries to pursue their dependent economic and political understanding. Neocolonialism, according to Nkrumah, Nkrumah, one of the presidents of African nations, means that leading or advocating of African liberations by Nkrumah provided a comprehensive analysis of neocolonialism in his book, Neocolonialism. The last stage of imperialism, which happened in 1965. He argued that even after gaining formal independence, African nations remain economically and politically dependent on the former colonial rulers and Western powers. So some of my friends will be in to give more on this topic as we continue with our discussion.
Okay, I'm Sharon Jerop, and I'm going to present on key features of neocolonialism in Nkrumah's view. Point number 1 is economic dependence. We find that Nkrumah argued that former colonies remained economically dependent on their former colonizers. This dependence was maintained through unequal trade agreements. There was foreign investments controlled by multinational corporations and the dominance of Western financial institutions. So we have an example here whereby the African countries often transported or exported these African countries often exported raw materials to Western national at low price, while importing manufactured goods at high prices, creating a cycle of economic disadvantage. As I can explain this is that the African countries, as we know, they are rich in minerals, for example, gold and other minerals. We know that these colonizers who colonized each country in Africa were exploiting and exporting raw materials to their countries, so that when they go there, they make them to be final products and bring back for market to Kenya, or not necessarily Kenya but Africa. Another point is that political influence. So political influence, this is whereby you find that despite gaining formal independence, Nkrumah believed that former colonies were still subject to political influence from their former colonizers. This influence could be exerted through diplomatic pressure, military intervention, and the support of pro-Western political functions with former colonies. So example here that we find is that the United States and other Western powers often intervene in African affairs to support the regimes friendly to their interests. Another point is the cultural domination. We find that according to Nkrumah's point of view, he said that according to Nkrumah, involved the continued dominance of Western culture and values in former colonies. This cultural domination was evident in education system, media and popular culture, which often reinforced Western perspectives and undermined local traditions. So we find here that these people these colonizers from Western part of Europe and from others from USA, they came to Africa to colonize Africa. They brought their cultures, and their culture which was among there was education, which they introduced Western education. They also introduced their language. They changed their language and made English to be the national language. They also changed and brought other things which made the Africans to adopt which made them to adopt and move on in their lives. Another point is that the exploitation of resources. So in the view of Nkrumah, he argued that former colonies continued to be exploited for their natural resources. So they were still exploiting resources even though they had gained their own independence in their countries. So they still came back for the resources, and they were extracting them at the low cost and often shipped them to Western nations for processing and sale, with little benefit to the producing countries. For example, the extraction of minerals like diamonds and gold in Africa often resulted in environmental damage and minimal economic benefit for local communities. Here we find the example of Congo, whereby there is this war that is going on there. The problem is that it's because of the minerals that they have. Africans are rich in minerals, but these colonizers, they didn't detach with us fully. They are still colonizing us in form of they want to dominate us in everything that we have as Africans. So the last point is the military dependence, and we find that Nkrumah believed that many former colonies remain dependent on their former colonizers for military equipment and training. This dependence created a vulnerability to Western influence and made it difficult for newly independent countries to pursue truly independent foreign policies. For example, many African countries relied on Western military aid and training, which could be used to pressure them into adopting pro-Western policies. As we know, Western countries plus the USA, they are really equipped in form of military. They have superior equipments. Their soldiers are well trained. So whenever we Africans, we want to have the best of the military, our military, we sometimes or we mostly rely on this European these European countries and USA, so that we can get better training to our soldiers, we get better equipments to use in our countries, and by doing so, we are adopting their policies. We are adopting their policies and doing whatever they want from us. So we find that these all things is what they still depend on Africans, is that they they are still depending on Africans, and that's why we are still have the problem, and we're still sleeping.
Okay, in continuation with our presentation, I'm going to take you through Nguruma's solution to new colonialism. I'm Asha Chamtai, and under this, we're going to look at Pan-Africanism, unity. Nguruma emphasized the need for a united Africa to counteract the pervasive influence of new colonial powers. He advocated for a political and economic union of African states to strengthen their collective bargaining power and reducing dependency on former colonial masters. The other point is economic independence. Nguruma advocated for economic self-sufficiency through the establishment of strong, independent African economy. This includes the nationalization of key industries and the creation of religion development projects. The other point is cultural liberation. Under this, Nguruma called for decolonization of African minds, challenging the influence of foreign culture, values, and ideologies. He urged Africans to reclaim their history, culture, and identity for colonial distortion and to promote Pan-African culture that emphasizes solidarity and unity. The other point is political mobilization and resistance. Nguruma highlights the importance of mass political mobilization to resist neo-colonialism force. He believed that the masses through organization and awareness can challenge the grip of neo-colonialism on their government. He also stressed the need for African leaders to be genuinely committed to independence and resist the temptation of foreign influence. The other point is internal economic cooperation. Nguruma advocates for establishment of new economic system that break away from the capitalist structure imposed by imperial powers. He suggests that African nations should form trade and economic alliance with other countries in the global south rather than relying on exploitative relationship with Western nations. Okay, the other part is relevance of Nguruma ideas. The first point is neocolonialism and economic exploitation. Under this, Nguruma urged that even after formal independence, many African countries remain economically dependent on former colonial powers and global capitalist institutions. This exploitation continues through multinational cooperation, international aid, and debt dynamics still visible in many developing countries today. The second point is political independence without economic control. He emphasized that political independence without economic control is insufficient. Many countries in Africa and the global south still face this dynamic where they can vote in election but remain dependent on foreign economic system, corporations, and institutions for their survival. The other point is role of multinational corporations. Nguruma highlights how multinational corporations play a key role in sustaining neocolonialism by exploiting local resources and labor. He said that profit to their home countries This is still a pressure issue as multinational companies continue to exert significant power over African economic and natural resources. The last point is Western influence and superpower rivalries. Nkrumah analyzed on how Western powers and superpower like USA and USSR during Cold War use political and economic tools to maintain dominance over newly independent nations is still relevant in today's global order. The influence of this power, alongside China's growing role, continue to shape the developing of Africa. I welcome the next presenter.
I'm Elvin Chepwesh, and I'm going to take you through the consequences of neocolonialism and the strategies of overcoming the negative effects of neocolonialism. Now, neocolonialism is a term coined by Kwame Nkrumah, who is the first president of Ghana, to describe the economic and political control that developed countries exert over developing countries, particularly in Africa. In his book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, Nkrumah argues that neocolonialism is a more subtle and insidious form of control than traditional colonialism, as it operates through economic and political means rather than direct military or political occupation. Economically, neocolonialism perpetuates a system of dependency in which African countries are reliant on developed countries for trade, investment, and aid. This dependency makes it difficult for African countries to develop their own economies and to break free from the cycle of poverty. There is also economic exploitation, whereby resources are used for the benefit of the controlling powers, not for the development of the neocolonial state, leading to a greater wealth gap. Politically, neocolonialism undermines the sovereignty of African states and makes it difficult for them to pursue their own interests. Foreign powers often interfere in the domestic affairs of African countries, supporting puppet regimes and destabilizing governments that are seen as unfriendly to their own interests. This interference makes it difficult for African countries to build strong and stable democracies. In addition to these economic and political consequences, neocolonialism also has a profound impact on African culture and society. The dominance of Western cultures and values can lead to the erosion of traditional African cultures and ways of life. This can have a devastating impact on African identity and self-esteem. Now, despite the challenges posed by neocolonialism, there are a number of strategies that African countries can adopt to overcome its negative consequences. One important strategy is to promote economic diversification and reduce reliance on primary commodity exports. This can be achieved through investment in manufacturing and value-added industries. Another important strategy is to strengthen regional integration and cooperation. This can help African countries to build stronger economies and to increase their bargaining power in the global economy. Africans also can promote ideological clarity by recognizing and combating the subtle ways in which neocolonialism operates. There is also building alliances through strengthening ties with other developing countries and progressive movements. There is also promoting Pan-Africanism. This includes uniting African states to resist neocolonialism and build a stronger, more independent continent. Finally, it is important for African countries to promote good governance and democracy. This can help to ensure that governments are accountable for their citizens and their foreign powers do not interfere in domestic affairs. By adopting these strategies, African countries can overcome negative consequences of neocolonialism and build a more prosperous and independent future. Thank you.
Hello, I'm called Tobias Wenje, and I'm going to take you through the economic dependence and control in Africa and many other developing countries. So some of the issues that has rooted in historical, political, and economical factors. These factors have led to long-standing inequalities and structures that continue to affect the development of these regions today. And some of the factors are, first one is the colonial legacy. Under colonial legacy, we have two factors, that is historical exploitation and lack of industrialization. Now let's give a focus to historical exploitation. Now, during the colonial era, many African nations and countries in the global south were subjected to resources extraction economies. Colonizers often established economies that were dependent on exporting raw materials to the colonial powers, leaving these countries with limited capacity to develop diversified, self-sustaining economies. Under lack of industrialization, let's look at the colonial powers often resisted the development of local industries that could compete with their own, ensuring that these countries would remain dependent on the export of raw materials. As a result, the development of manufacturing sectors were hindered, and many African economies remain dependent on agricultural exports or raw materials, which are vulnerable to global market fluctuations. Now, the second factor was debt dependency. Now, there was external debt. Many African nations and countries in global south are heavily indebted, often to the international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, that is the IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions have imposed structural adjustment programs, that is CAPS, in the past, which demanded austerity measures, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and degradation of the economy, which in many cases worsened poverty, unemployment, and as well inequality. Now let's get to the third point, that is the global trade and market control. And under the global trade and market control, we have price volatility. Now, what do we mean by price volatility? Countries that depend heavily on a few primary exports, such as oil, cocoa, or minerals, are vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices. When prices fall, these nations can experience severe economic crisis, further entrenching their dependency. Now, and the fourth point is foreign directive investment, that is FDI, and exploitation. Under FDI, we have resources extractions and multinationals. Many African nations attract foreign direct investments in sectors like mining, oil, and agriculture. However, multinational cooperatives often extract vast resources with minimal reinvestments in the local economy. These companies often exploit the local workforce, pay low wages, and engage in practices that harm the environment. And lastly, we have what is political influence and corruption. And under political influence and corruption, we have two factors, that is political instability and corruption. Now, under political instability, economic dependence often comes hand in hand with political instability. External factors such as former colonial powers, global superpowers, or multinational corporations may intervene politically to maintain control over resources or support regimes that are favorable to their interests, even if these regimes are corrupt or repressive. And under corruption, in many cases, domestic corruption exacerbates economic dependency. Leaders may mismanage resources or align themselves with foreign powers in exchange for personal or political gains, hindering national development and perpetuating cycles of dependency. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you.